All right, we're going to talk about using the engine. And the engine that we're using right now is Unity 3D. And we're going to discuss how to get more functionality while using this engine. So the basic way, the most common way you would get functionality out of out of Unity is to script the functionality that you want, access the components, and manipulate those components through script. As you remember, when you just hit play in Unity, if you don't have any scripts or any functionality on an object, so if I turn that off and turn this script off and turn the generic behavior off, these don't really do anything. This falls because rigid body actually uh, works kind of under the scenes to give it physical properties. But I can't press any buttons. I can't put any interaction into this game because I don't have the functionality to do so without scripting or some way to do that. So we discussed other ways to do that rather than just just scripting in text. Some of the issues with scripting. You will learn how to script throughout this degree, and it's going to open a lot of functionality so that the things that you design, you're going to be able to realize them, and that is the I think that's the most exciting part of game design and development is not just coming up with the ideas, but actually getting to play the ideas and figuring out how to make those things work within the space that we have. So we also mentioned that there's tools to kind of uh, to get over some of the syntax of scripting and get past some of the errors and some of the roadblocks that stop people from getting their functionality. So we discussed the generic behavior. And that's what I want to go over is getting functionality through generic behavior right now. Next lecture, we'll have some more talk about scripting and the difference between the two. And you're going to see that they're very similar. They try to achieve the same thing. So with generic behavior, I have a project here that has generic behaviors on it, and I'm going to remove this component here. I'm going to leave this script on, but I just deactivate it by clicking this little check mark right here. And so let's talk about the parts of using a generic behavior. I'm going to go to scripts, go to minimum, put a generic behavior on here. And I spoke briefly about this in the last lecture, but I'm going to go a little more in depth with it. So it has the events. So we add events to generic behaviors when we want functionality. You should only have one generic behavior component on each game object. So you shouldn't have multiple generic behaviors. What you should have is multiple events. So you can create an event by clicking new event here. Uh, and when you see this, there's parts that come up to the events that you have. And the first is, first you can see there's a name here. So we should name this when we figure out what we want this to do. And I don't know what I want this to do yet, so I'm going to figure out. So if I said I want a game mechanic to work on this cube, and I want this cube to do something, um, let's move, what do I want it to do and when do I want it to happen? The first question well, depending on how you want to look at it, but when you want this thing to happen is going to happen in your system events. So if I click on system events, you're going to see nothing. You're going to see awake, and awake is very similar to start. There's some differences between the two that I don't need to get into right now. But awake and start, these two things are when the object is when the object is created. So if it's in the scene already, as soon as you hit play, awake and start are going to happen. The concept of update, these happen once. Start and awake happen once, and these are similar to Unity. In Unity, you have, if you were scripting these things, as I showed before, when you create a new script, it gives you start and it gives you awake in the script. So this is trying to be as similar to the events that happen in Unity as possible. So update, we spoke about update, and update it runs continuously in a loop throughout your project. So we've been using this if we wanted to continuously check something or something to happen over and over and over and over again really, really fast. We would use update. And there's 3 updates here. You don't really need to worry about these other ones right now. Fixed is usually done when you're doing physics objects, and late is generally used when you're doing rendering things. But It's a little bit more advanced. We don't need to talk about that. So you really just need to know when you would want to use update, and that's when you want something to happen over and over, or you want to continuously check for something. So start, awaken, update. We have these other ones in here that are like on collision enter. So this would be when you wanted collision is different than a trigger. And I mentioned that when I talked about the colliders on an object. If I go up to this component, my box collider here, there's something called isTrigger here. And if you make this a trigger, then it's going to have collision detection, but it's not going to have collision reaction, meaning that you could walk right through it. It'll say that you walked through this and give you a notification that that happened, but it's not going to stop you from walking through it. So Unity checks that in two different ways. So if you know that you're going to hit something and not just walk through it, you're going to want to use collision enter and collision stay. And collision stay is if you're constantly on something, if you not just the first time that you hit it, this is going to continue to happen as long as you are touching that object. And exit is when you leave and you stop touching that object. So you can use these things to create interesting game mechanics based on what functionality you want to happen. Trigger's the same thing, except it's just when you have this checked. So if you have this checked, isTrigger, you will not get on collision events to happen because it's not going to collide with anything. It's just going to use a trigger detection. So if this is clicked as a trigger, you're going to have to use your, I don't want to update, you're going to have to use your all these trigger enter, stay, and exit because it's a trigger at that point. So don't get those two confused. Make sure you understand these are specific to what type of collider you have on there, whether it's a trigger or it's not a trigger, which would just be collision with things. So that's collision and interaction events, and then you have your input events. And your input events are, when you're going to get input and how you're going to get input. So down is just going to happen once when you press it down and not again one time. Same with up. Up is going to be when you let go of that input. Input press is going to continuously happen as long as you have that button pressed. So this is a lot like when you think about update. As long as that button's down, this is going to continue to do whatever you asked it to do. And then input any is just going to be anything that happens. It will send an event. The last thing we're looking at is message events. So message events are things that you want to call at a certain time from somewhere else, usually. You'll say, I want this thing to happen at a certain time. And that's when you're going to use a message event. It doesn't do anything on its own. You have to actually call this from something else, like as a reaction to something happening. So that's how you would decide what system event you want with this. You kind of say, what do I want to happen, and figure out the right system event that you want. So that's kind of when that happens. And I can just do input down or something here, right? So the game action that we're looking at is what you want to happen. And there's a lot of different things here that you're going to have to explore on what you want to happen. So some of the the simple ones that we would use is, let's look at motion. So if we wanted to move something, there's a few ways to do that. But if you wanted to add a force to an object, you can just do that with motion, right? To add a force, remember, to get forces, you must have a rigid body on it because the game object doesn't know about physical forces unless it has a rigid body. So if I wanted to, on a button press, if I wanted to add a force to this, I could do when I want it to happen, and let's just say input down keyboard, and I'm just going to say space. I'm going to put space here, if I can find it. Space. I don't know where it's at. Space, right there. So when I press the space down once, I want this to add a force to this. And I'm going to take gravity off this just so we can see this so it doesn't fall. And the force type that I want is, so then there's all these options down here. And force type, I just want a regular, I'll just do an impulse, I guess. And I want a force type. And the direction I want it to go is right in the positive X. And I want it to hit it pretty hard, so I'm going to do it 50. And so on this object, my awesome GameCube here that I created. It shouldn't fall because I have gravity turned off, but I have functionality here. When I hit the space button, it adds a force to it and that thing moves. So now I have functionality with this. I can input something into the system. I know that when I wanted to do it was on input down, and then I chose what I wanted to happen. So there's a lot of other game actions here that you could use, and I'll go over. We'll have little videos on how to use some of these things. If I wanted to load a new level, I could load a scene. If I wanted to modify a value in and we'll talk about these privates in the values that I have, I could use modify value. If I wanted to randomize something, if I wanted to change something, register a change in a value, I could do that. Compute data, call event. So call event is going to be another one that we use a lot. Remember I talked about these message types, right? So if I made this a message, this would be an event that I would call. So like my message, right? And this, I did the same thing. I could do motion, and impulse force 1 and 50 is a message now. So this isn't going to happen when I press space anymore because it's just a message. So nothing's going to happen. I would have to call this event when I wanted this to happen. And this can get, so when I hit, now if I did on input down here, keyboard space, hopefully I find it a bit easier this time, space, and what I want to do here is my action is I want to call an event. And the event I want to call, I could check right here, choose message as an event, my message, and I'm just going to have it move. And the object I want me to, I just want to interact on myself, so I can just pick game object there. And so I just want to call this. So now, instead of just putting that on that, if I hit the button, this is actually calling this message. And this is really useful because you can get all types of things to happen as messages and really control when you want them to happen in the order you want them to happen in. So events and messages are really important in using this system also. So that's the two first parts, the system event, when you want it to happen, and then what you want to happen. And then each thing will have its separate things here on what you can do with each game action. The next parts that I want to discuss are, so I talked about system events, and I talked about game actions. We talked about start, update, collision, messages, and all these, there's a bunch of different game actions, and there'll be more as this is updated. The next thing I want to talk about is stored values. So if you understand the concept of a variable, that's great. If you don't, you'll still understand this. So when you're scripting, you can create variables to store data that you want to use. Generic behavior has its own storage for data, but it doesn't allow, it's kind of constrained to only allowing you to store certain things. And you have to get creative with how you use them. So instead of being able to create a ton of variables that you can get lost in, it says you have one place to make some storage of some different types of variables, and you're going to have to use that. So these privates that you're going to be using, private variables per generic behavior, if you look at the different types, we have value storage, string storage, vector modifier. So this value storage, we're going to be using this very interestingly, or you're going to find new ways to use this, and we can set this and check this for different values. And you'll see that in the Pong assignment. We actually use the score. We use value storage for the score here. And you can use it for all types of things. You could use it for health. You could use it for a lot of different things. String storage would be if you wanted to store like a word or a string. Your vector modifiers, this is where you could store a vector. So if you needed to store something for later, like a position or something, you could store that in here. And then there's other just registers that you can have here. These are all registers that we could change, that you would have, that you could store different values in, and colors and all types of things. So this is kind of where you can work and data that you can use to check things and change things. And the last thing I want to discuss about generic behavior is the object access list. So the object access list, we need to be able to, there are times where we want to be able to communicate with other objects. So if something happens to this object, I want to be able to tell another object to do something. So if I wanted to update a score or you know, have something else take damage. So if something touched me and I wanted it to take damage, I would have to know about it. And if I wanted to check, I can do those things in collision, but I also, you know, I could just directly manipulate that object if it was the only object I cared about. So I can add to this object access list right here. If I just put a 1 in here and hit enter, it's going to give me the ability to start adding objects to here. So really quickly, if I wanted to manipulate this cube, if I wanted to change something on this cube, I would put it in my object access list. And you can see that this script is on this My Awesome GameCube here. But if I wanted it to act if I wanted this force to act on this cube, I don't think this cube has a rigid body on it. It doesn't, so I'm going to add one under physics, rigid body. And if I wanted this to act on that, I can actually talk to this cube now from this cube. If I went down here and I said, on this space event, what object do I want to call? And I don't know if this message is actually, it might need this object message. This might need a my message motion on it also. I'm going to try it out. But on cube, I want it to do this. It may not work. It's not going to work on that cube because this, I would need to call its, I would need to make a message on this cube and make a generic behavior so I could call its message. But once this object access list, this is going to allow me to access other objects in the world and start acting upon them and communicating with them. So, or checking for very specific objects. If I wanted to make sure that this was the only object I wanted to interact with, I could put them in here. And you'll see different examples of that later on when we go over this a little bit more. So that's basically the major parts of generic behavior. Your system events, your game actions, when do I do it, what do I want to do, how do I store my data and check my data, and then how do I interact with other objects in the world. And so there'll be a video that will be in the assignment that will show you a lot more pieces of this. And then I want to discuss, why are we using this generic behavior? I touched on it a couple times in different videos. Because we can script all this stuff and get this same functionality. And generic behavior is actually a script. If I went into this project and I go under generic behavior, all the code to actually do this is in here. All the script, the generic behavior script, is in this package, and you can look at it under generic behavior. It's a very large script, but you can look at the code that actually runs all this stuff. And this is generic behavior here. This is actually not the one I wanted to look at. Let's look at this one. Very large. There's a lot of code going on here that allows generic behavior to do what it does. And you can see there's a lot of lines of code in this. But it is just script. It is the same thing. It is getting functionality. It just has script in it that allows us to see these things in the editor, manipulate things, and then under the scenes it actually runs the script for it. So it's a great tool to use to get functionality with having to go into script. But just remember that it is script, and there's functionality. If you understand what you're doing there, you can understand what's actually happening in script and do it in script, as long as we understand the syntax. So we are limited in our game actions that we can do. There's a kind of some when you're in script, you have a lot more freedom to do a lot more things, but we are limited to what the tool gives us. We are limited in our simplified variables. We can't really create our own variables on the fly. We have to get creative with the data points that we were given in our stored variables, or our private stored variables. We can still access objects through our object list, just like you would in code. You can access different objects by either putting a variable type of that and putting it in through the inspector, and we'll go over that in the next lecture for all the things that you can do. So the stuff you can do in generic behavior, we can do all in script, and generic behavior itself is a script. It just has a lot of editor script on it that allows you to run the underlying script through the inspector and get functionality here instead of here. And so some people get really scared of this We're going to get more practice with it later on in the degree and some in this class, and we're going to get to the point where this isn't scary, but we have tools that allow us to get functionality without having to go into